The grainy glow of cell phones lit the quiet Virginia night as bystanders angled their cameras toward the shoulder of the two-lane highway, catching every barked order, every rough shove, every gleam of the handcuffs locking around David Carter's wrists. None of them knew who he was. To them, he was just another black man being pressed against the hood of a car. Calm voice drowned out by the aggression of Officer Mark Dugan. The videos traveled faster than the patrol car could make it back to the Grantsville police station. Within minutes, the first clip hit Facebook with the caption, "He didn't do nothing, they planted that bag," followed by shaky TikTok edits looping Dugan's triumphant grin as he waved the cocaine baggie. By the time Carter was led past the booking desk, mugshots taken beneath buzzing fluorescent lights, the footage had crossed state lines, picked up by accounts hungry for the next viral outrage. On Twitter, the hashtag #WashingGrantsvilleStop surfaced, then mutated into Justice Forum, and within hours climbed into trending territory. Comment threads swelled with arguments, half the posts insisting it was just another drug bust, the other half calling it proof that racial profiling was alive and thriving. At a coffee shop in town, a teenager who had filmed part of the arrest saw his phone explode with notifications as strangers begged him not to delete the clip. He felt a jolt of fear when local officers knocked on his door the next morning, politely suggesting he hand over the video for evidence. He lied, saying his phone had crashed while the file continued to rack up millions of plays online. National media took the bait. Morning talk shows debated whether small-town cops were keeping communities safe or crossing constitutional lines. Commentators dissected Carter's body language, some praising his composure, others mocking his politeness as guilty men trying to talk their way out. In the glare of the cameras, Chief Robert Kane called a press conference on the courthouse steps. Square-jawed, medals gleaming on his uniform, Kane declared the stop was textbook policing and warned outsiders not to smear Grantsville's reputation. He dismissed the videos as selectively edited and described Carter as a suspected trafficker from out of town. Behind him, Officer Mark Dugan stood stiff, eyes cold, the very image of a cop backed by his chief. What Kane did not realize was that the more he denied, the more oxygen he poured onto the fire. The hashtag mutated again. Now Nunmachar planting evidence, spurred by commenters who slowed the video frame by frame and claimed they could see Dugan bend suspiciously inside the Audi before emerging with the bag. Others dug into statistics, uncovering that Dugan had made dozens of similar stops in recent years, nearly all involving minorities, with suspiciously identical arrest reports. By nightfall, Grantsville was a national name. Protesters gathered in front of the police station, small at first, then swelling as activists from Richmond and D.C. drove in, carrying signs reading "Cameras don't lie" and "Justice for the unknown man." Inside his cell, David Carter sat with his hands folded, silent, watching through the bars as officers whispered nervously and glanced at their buzzing phones. He knew what was happening without checking a single screen. He had built his career in a world where perception spread faster than fact. Yet what gave him pause was the thought that millions were rallying to defend him without knowing he was the FBI director. To them, he was just another target of abuse, faceless except for a few seconds of video. It was the rawest proof imaginable that the system treated black men the same, no matter their title, their salary, their power. Meanwhile, Ethan Ross, the rookie officer, scrolled through his own feed on a department computer, his stomach tightening as he recognized himself in the background of viral clips. His conscience gnawed louder with every comment, accusing him of complicity. He had not planted the drugs, but he had stood by. He had obeyed. Now the whole nation was watching, and silence felt like guilt. As the uproar grew, one voice cut through the din. Karen Blake, deputy director of the FBI, striding into the Grantsville station with a small cadre of agents and bureau windbreakers. Her face was set in grim lines as she demanded Carter's release. her voice echoing off the cracked linoleum walls. For a beat, the station froze, every officer caught between shock and denial, until Chief Kane blustered forward, dismissing her claims. But then Carter himself stepped from the cell, posture straight despite the red marks on his wrists, and for the first time since the stop, he let the full weight of his identity land. "Chief Kane," he said evenly, "I am Chum. David Carter, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The silence was absolute, then fractured by gasps, mutters, and the sound of phones buzzing with reporters already outside the building. Dugan's face drained of color, his earlier arrogance collapsing into panic. While Ross's shoulders sagged with something that looked like shame, Kane's jaw tightened as he tried to recover. But the tide had turned. The videos had already made Carter a symbol. Now his name transformed him into a storm. Across the nation, anchors repeated it with disbelief. The man framed in Grantsville is the FBI director, and the social media fire became a wildfire impossible to contain. Carter said nothing more in that moment. He didn't need to. The world was already listening, and the game that Dugan thought he was winning had just been flipped upside down. The news cycle moved like a tidal wave, and David Carter found himself at the eye of it. Overnight, the clips of his arrest replayed on every network, split screens of his calm, cuffed composure against the swaggering face of Officer Mark Dugan as he held up the planted bag. Commentators filled the air with their chatter, some hailing Carter as the living proof of racial profiling, others insisting the nation shouldn't rush to judgment. But when the FBI confirmed his identity, the tone shifted from outrage to shock. It wasn't just any man dragged from his car. It was the director of the Bureau itself. Protests swelled into something bigger. Civil rights leaders called for federal probes. Students marched in DACC. Hashtags like "YUBKU Badge of Injustice" and "Carter Case" trended globally. For Carter, the revelation was both shield and sword. He was too visible now for Grantsville to bury the case quietly. Yet his position made him a lightning rod for attacks. Chief Robert Kane struck first, staging another press conference in front of his flag-draped office, his voice dripping with injured pride as he declared that his department was the victim of a federal witch hunt orchestrated by a power-hungry director seeking to distract from his own misconduct. Dugan stood behind him, pale and tight-lipped, while Kane spun a narrative of outsiders vilifying honest cops who had risked their lives to keep drugs off the streets. Within hours, sympathetic media outlets amplified Kane's words. Headlines hinting that Carter had a checkered past, stories surfacing about supposed college drug use, whispers of suspicious finances. None of it held water, but the intent was clear. Smear him, drown truth in mud, make the public doubt. Carter watched it unfold from his D.C. office, Karen Blake at his side, her jaw clenched as she slid article after article across his desk. "They're coordinated," she said, her tone low and urgent. "This isn't just Kane covering himself. Someone bigger is feeding these stories." Carter nodded, the muscles in his face unreadable, though inside the weight pressed harder. His own bureau wasn't immune to leaks. Files he'd ordered sealed were appearing in editorials, distorted to fit the smear. The realization was chilling. Someone inside his walls was feeding the opposition. That night, his phone buzzed with a private call from Ethan Ross, the rookie officer whose unease had been captured in every viral clip. The young man's voice trembled, thick with fear. "Director Carter, I can't stay quiet anymore. There's more. It's not just Dugan. The whole department, Chief Kane, there's a system. Evidence planting, asset seizures, kickbacks. I've seen it. I've heard it." Carter listened in silence, letting the rookie's guilt pour through the line. When Ross finally broke down, Carter spoke gently, almost like a father. "Ethan, if you want to do the right thing, we'll protect you, but you have to be prepared. They will come after you." Ross agreed, his voice small but resolute. Moments after the call ended, Carter stared out at the night beyond his window. Below, D.C. glowed with the hum of politics and power, yet he felt the shadows closing in. For the first time, he understood the scope of what he'd stumbled into. This wasn't a rogue officer in a small town. It wasn't even a corrupt chief. It was a network fortified by money, influence, and fear. And now it had declared war on him. His arrest in Grantsville had lit the match. The counterattack was already burning. The smear campaigns would only intensify. The threats would grow sharper, and the line between justice and survival would blur. But David Carter, forged by South Chicago streets and bureau wars, had never once turned from a fight. The question that haunted him as dawn cracked over the Potomac wasn't whether he could endure the storm, but how many others would be consumed by it before the truth finally broke free. The smear campaign grew teeth, its bite sharper each day, and by the third week, Carter's name was dragged through headlines like mud tracked across a white floor. Editorials hinted at impropriety, commentators spoke of possible resignation, and Kane paraded in front of cameras with rehearsed indignation, painting Grantsville's officers as martyrs of federal overreach. Behind the curtain, threats multiplied. Ethan Ross's family photographed outside their home, Carter's ex-wife followed by an unmarked SUV, evidence files tampered with in supposedly secure servers. The message was clear: back off or be destroyed. Carter understood the game. If he fought head-on, they would drown him in lies. If he hid behind the bureau, they would paint him as a coward. So he chose the one move none of them expected. He appeared to surrender. The press room at FBI headquarters was suffocating with anticipation when he stepped to the podium. His voice was steady, his eyes unreadable as he announced he would temporarily step aside to allow investigations into the allegations against him. The gasp of shock rolled through the room like thunder. By evening, pundits declared his career finished. Kane toasted victory at his lake house, and Dugan swaggered again, whispering that the heat was off. They believed they had won. But in a quiet command center 30 miles outside Washington, Carter sat with Karen Blake in a circle of trusted agents, eyes locked on a digital map of connections. Names of officers, prosecutors, judges, businessmen, all strung together by money and mutual protection. Phase 1 complete, Carter said, his voice clipped. Now we let them get careless. The trap was elegant. His apparent downfall had loosened tongues. Surveillance teams disguised as caterers wired Kane's lake house, capturing every boast, every incriminating toast. Drunk with arrogance, Kane raised a glass, laughing about teaching that arrogant director a lesson. While Dugan bragged about planting evidence like it was sport, judges chuckled about rubber-stamping forfeitures, businessmen murmured about laundering assets. Every word was recorded, every face captured in high definition. Meanwhile, another team shadowed Dugan as he snuck to the county records facility, intent on burning files. They let him break the lock, let him drag gasoline cans across the floor, let him strike the match, then agents swarmed, catching him in the act, his stunned face frozen forever on camera. Carter watched it all unfold in real time, each domino tipping the next. The man who had been paraded in cuffs weeks earlier was now orchestrating one of the largest corruption stings in modern history, invisible behind the mask of disgrace. When dawn broke, federal convoys rolled through Grantsville and beyond, doors kicked in, warrants served, nearly 40 officials arrested before breakfast. Kane himself was yanked from his bed, dripping with shower water, as agents recited charges of conspiracy, racketeering, and civil rights violations. By noon, the same anchors who had declared Carter finished were breathlessly reporting on Operation Clean Badge, the sting that had exposed a multi-state network of corruption. Carter stepped once more into the press room, tie knotted, eyes steel. No longer the disgraced director, but the man who had played his enemies like pieces on a board. "This was never about me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of vindication. "It was about a system that preys on the powerless. And today that system has begun to fall." The applause from his agents echoed louder than the cameras. But Carter knew the battle was not yet over. What lay ahead was bigger than Grantsville, bigger than Kane or Dugan. What he had uncovered was a disease spread through veins of power itself. And now, with the nation watching, he intended to cut it out, no matter how deep the knife had to go. The raids struck like lightning at dawn. Unmarked vehicles sweeping through Grantsville and four surrounding counties, federal agents fanning out in a choreography planned down to the minute, doors broken open, startled officials dragged into daylight, cuffed and furious. Robert Kane was hauled dripping from his bathroom, his protest drowned by the recitation of charges: conspiracy against civil rights, racketeering, obstruction of justice. Mark Dugan, already caught in the act of torching county records, was marched past television cameras, his earlier sneer replaced by the slack jaw of a man realizing prison had become inevitable. By mid-morning, 39 officials sat in custody: officers, judges, prosecutors, clerks, each one a node in the cancer Carter had mapped. News helicopters circled overhead, feeding live images into a national bloodstream that only days earlier had been filled with whispers of his disgrace. Now anchors spoke the words sting operation, historic takedown, systemic corruption. In Washington, the Attorney General took the podium to reveal the full scope of Operation Clean Badge, praising David Carter's audacity in allowing his reputation to be sacrificed to catch predators in the open. That afternoon, Carter walked through the same FBI press room where he had once announced his step-aside. This time, there was no bowed head, no hint of defeat. He stood flanked by Karen Blake and the agents who had carried the operation on their shoulders. The applause of his staff thundered through the corridors, reporters shouting questions that he answered with calm precision. He described how racial profiling had been weaponized into a profit machine, how planted evidence had stolen homes and livelihoods, how courts had been bent to serve greed instead of justice. He promised restitution for victims, oversight for departments, and reform written into law. Trials followed in waves. Kane was sentenced to decades in federal prison, his empire reduced to testimony and seized assets. Dugan broke on the stand, confessing to training sessions where rookies were taught how to spot profitable targets, minorities in nice cars, out-of-towners unlikely to contest. Judges who had rubber-stamped seizures were stripped of their robes. Prosecutors faced their own indictments, and state legislators, once smug with influence, now heard the clang of cell doors. A class action settlement delivered millions back to families who had been bled dry. And in Grantsville itself, a civilian review board was established. A new chief recruited from outside. Every officer fitted with body cameras. The department that once stalked its citizens now reported to them. A year later, Carter stood before a graduating class at Quantico. The auditorium hushed as his voice carried. He spoke not of triumph, but of vigilance, of how corruption grows when silence becomes habit, of how a badge means nothing unless it shields every citizen equally. He told them of Ethan Ross, the young officer who chose conscience over complicity and now served in the FBI's new police integrity unit, training others to resist the first steps toward rot. He told them of communities healing, of justice reclaimed not as a gift, but as a right. And when he returned to Grantsville, driving the same road where Dugan had stopped him, he was pulled over once more, this time by a young black officer with a professional tone and a body camera glinting on her vest, who told him his taillight really was out. He smiled at the symmetry, thanked her for her service, and drove on. That night, he visited a community center funded by restitution, where families who had once been victims now counseled others on how to fight back, reclaim what was stolen, and believe again in the law. As he shook hands, as children ran laughing through halls that had once echoed with despair, Carter understood that his arrest, his humiliation, had been the spark for something larger. Justice was no longer an abstract word. It was visible here, in the faces of people who once thought they had no voice. What began as a planted bag of powder on a lonely road had grown into a reckoning that shook courts, legislatures, and police stations across 5 states. And though Carter knew the work was endless, he also knew this. Change had come because corruption had been dragged into the light, and light is the one thing darkness cannot survive.